I welcome you all to a new course titled Foundations of Psychology, Concepts and Applications. So, as the title suggests, this is a course that will look into the foundational aspects of the discipline of psychology, and this course is little bit different from a lot of other introduction to psychology course in a sense that this is not just conceptual discussion. This course will also include a lot of application oriented discussions. So, this is a foundational course on psychology which focuses both on conceptual understanding as well as the various application of those concepts and more specific applications in the various life domains. So, before we talk about the first lecture, let me introduce you to the overall structure of this course. So, this is a 12-week course, which means there will be 12 modules in this course, and it is structured around various concepts of psychology which are very foundational concepts in psychology. So, we will focus on core concepts, we will also focus on major theories in the different concepts or topics of psychology. We will also focus on research methods, what are the basic research methods that are utilized to understand all these concepts. And obviously, we will also focus on practical applications of lot of these concepts and specifically how lot of these concepts can be applied in the various life domains. So, each of these modules will explore both theoretical as well as applied aspects in each of these modules. So, how we will address this particular course is that we will discuss various conceptual understanding, theoretical understanding of various modules, and in each of these modules we will also focus on how all these concepts, we will select some of these concepts and we will see how some of these concepts can be applied in the real life context. So, that is the approach of all the modules, and at the end of the course few modules are specifically dedicated for discussing how psychology in general, the various concepts of psychology in general can be applied in the various life domains such as workplace, workplace and various law, sports and so on. So, we will talk about that. So, the core concepts that we will address in this course or focus in this course includes some of these core concepts. We will focus on biological basis of behavior, we will talk about sensations and perceptions, we will focus on learning, memory, thinking, motivation and emotion, personality and social behavior, psychological disorders and treatment. So, these are the basic concepts in psychology, and we will focus on each of these concepts and some of the application around these concepts. And the last few modules will focus on specific applications in various life domains, which includes things like how psychology can be applied to education, health, workplace, therapy, law, environment and sports. So, this is how this course will be different from a lot of these other introduction to psychology course, because this course balances both theoretical concepts as well as application of these concepts in specific life areas and domains. Now, let us start the first module of this course, which is titled as the science of psychology. So, in this module, so this is the module 1. So, here we will just introduce you what is the meaning of psychology, how it is defined and some of the historical background and the research method involved in it. So, that will be the module 1, and the today's lecture is titled as Introducing Psychology. So, this is the first lecture, and in this lecture we will try to address how can we understand the meaning of psychology, the various meanings around it, how to define it and some of the historical development that led to the present state of the psychology as a discipline. That is, the today's lecture is about introducing a lot of these background stories of psychology. So, the key concept that we will be focusing in today's lecture includes, we will define psychology, we will see what is the scope of contemporary psychology, what are the goals of psychology, and we will also look into some of the historical aspects, not in too much of details, but like some broad developments that led to that shaped the development of psychology as a discipline. So, origin and brief history of psychology. In that we will also focus on some of the earlier schools of thoughts, and at the end we will talk about contemporary perspectives in psychology. So, this will be the major concept that we will discuss in today's lecture. So, let us start with the most fundamental question before we can understand anything else is what is psychology and how do we define it. Okay. So, there are many ways to define psychology, various books will define it various ways, but one of the common definition that is you can find commonly discussed in most of the textbooks and other things and which kind of captures the essence of psychology as a discipline is that psychology is defined as the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. It is a very basic definition and which kind of captures the gist of the discipline of psychology. So, how can we define psychology? It is scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So, we need to understand few terms here. One is that it is saying psychology as a discipline includes scientific study, or it is science. Second is that what are the content of this discipline? It studies behavior and mental processes. So, these are the three important components of this definition. One is psychology is a science, or it uses a scientific method to understand the or kind of gather the data and then make certain conclusions and generalizations. What it studies? It studies behavior and mental processes. So, let us little bit unpack each of these terms, so that we can understand what is the meaning of psychology as a discipline. Now, when we talk about science, so there are certain hallmarks when we say a particular discipline is science or particular inquiry use a scientific method. What does that mean? So, when we say a discipline is science, one of the basic idea around is that whenever any discipline is called as science, that means this discipline uses scientific method to acquire knowledge. So, what is scientific method? Scientific method or science in general tries to understand any phenomena through systematic inquiry and scientific method. So, the key term here is scientific method, and this method kind of makes any inquiry as science or any discipline as science, simply because they use a scientific method. So, what is scientific method? So, there are certain characteristics that needs to be there to call a particular inquiry or mode of inquiry as scientific, or a method of acquiring knowledge as scientific method. So, some of these characteristics include, like scientific method uses something called as systematic observation, which is also called as empiricism. That means, science studies only those phenomena which can be detected using our sense organs, the 5 sense organs, eyes, ears, through touching, smelling and so on. So, science will never study anything that cannot be detected. Okay? So, we cannot collect data for any phenomena which cannot be detected using our sense organs. So, those things will not come under the preview of science. Okay? So, science uses empirical method, means it only looks into those phenomena which can be detected using sense organ or by enhancing those sense organ using certain instruments. For example, I cannot see everything through my eyes. So, but I can use telescope to see things which are in a very long distance. Okay? So, that means I am enhancing the capability of my eyes through certain instruments. So, like this, there are many instruments that have been developed to do research in science. These instrument basically what it does, it enhances the capabilities of our sense organs. So, science uses or kind of studies only those phenomena which can be detected through our sense organ, and they do not just study phenomena randomly, they study phenomena using systematic observation. That means, there has to be systematic steps to be followed to come to a conclusion. We can just randomly observe something and make conclusion, that will not be scientific, simply because there can be lot of errors and selective observation. We do not know all the stories around it, especially when we talk about human life, society and so on. If we make certain conclusion based on just selective observation, there can be so many errors in our observation, so many errors in our conclusions. So, science never studies something just randomly or selectively, it always focuses on systematic observation. So, there are certain systematic steps follows, and then we can make much more confident conclusions about any phenomena. So, that is one thing. Second thing is objectivity. Objectivity means what? That findings should be free from personal biases. So, in scientific inquiry, one should not impose one's own biases or whatever they think they know about something, then it is biased. You have to just detect or observe whatever is available through your sense organ and so on, and then you have to make conclusions. Okay? So, findings should be free from your personal biases. One should not impose their own understanding and whatever they think should be there, then it is not pure observation, then it is biased observation. Replicability and verifiability is another important factors in scientific method, because if you did some research and you found something and no one else is able to find those result again, that means there is some problem in your methodology, because you are the only person who got it, others are not finding it using the same methodology. So, if it is not replicable, verifiable, then there is a question mark in that. So, scientific method requires you that your findings, your methodology has to be replicable, it has to be falsifiable, it has to be verifiable and so on. So, these are some of the hallmarks of scientific method, and we will elaborate more on these characteristics in the next lecture, which focuses on the research method in psychology. So, basically these are some of the characteristics, and there are more which we will discuss later. So, psychology as a discipline, when it says it is a science or it uses a scientific method, that means these are the characteristics that are followed in the research of psychology or in the method of or acquiring knowledge in the field of psychology. So, that is the meaning of science, although science can be pure sciences, science can be social sciences and so on, but the term science basically means they use a scientific method, and scientific method has these characteristics. Now, what is the content of the psychology? What are the things that are studied in psychology? One is behavior. Behavior basically means actions that can be observed and measured. So, for example, I am moving my hand, it can be observed. I can say that this person is moving hands, and I can also measure the movement and so on. So, these are like actions or behaviors which can be observable. So, in psychology, behavior means observable actions that can be measured, and so this behavior includes animals and humans. So, psychology not only studies human behavior, although largely the focus is on human behavior, but lot of psychological research are also in the area of animal behavior. So, we will see when we discuss lot of these subjects like learning and so on, lot of these classic studies that came out in psychology are actually based on animal studies. So, psychologists also study animal behavior, and then they also study human behavior. So, it is not just human behavior, obviously it is predominantly humans, but lot of studies are also conducted on animals. So, one thing is behavior, psychology studies behavior. What is the another thing? Another thing is mental processes. So, mental processes is a very broad term which includes varieties of activities of mind. Mind does lot of things, mind has so many functions, and so this whole course is designed and divided into various functions of human mind. Okay? So, it includes activities of the mind such as perception, thinking, memory, imagination, etc. So, mind has so many functions and activities. So, mental processes includes all these activities and things that are included under mental processes. So, obviously, each of these mental functions we will discuss one by one, the different modules. So, when we talk about psychology, it is a scientific study or science of behavior and mental processes. Behavior means observable actions which can be measured. Mental processes means it cannot be directly observable, but it can be inferred from the different actions and behaviors. It includes lot of these mental processes such as perception, thinking, memory, imagination, etc. So, this is one of the kind of very definition of psychology, which kind of captures the gist of what psychology is all about. What is the origin of this term? So, let us kind of look into little bit of stories around psychology. So, psychology originally meant study of soul when originally the term was used. So, it was typically studied in the theology and other thing. So, psychology originally meant study of soul. When the word soul comes, it typically in the theology and religious sphere people talk about it. So, it is derived from the Greek word psyche is generally means soul. It also means mind, but more specifically it means soul. Logos basically means study, knowledge or discourse. So, it is a study of soul. That was the original meaning of psychology, which is derived from a Greek word, okay, psyche and logos. So, however, this whole idea of what psychology is all about, the definition that I gave, it evolved over time. So many different concepts were there one after the other, so there was an evolution in the meaning of the psychology, the term psychology itself. So, the meaning and the focus of psychology has evolved over time. So, let us see some of the evolution that happened. So, historically evolution of the meaning of the term psychology, how it evolved. So, if you see the early psychology focused on the study of soul, that was typically under religious and theological study. So, that was the original meaning. Then the later emphasis shifted on the word like psychology should study the mind, then the consciousness. These are the terms that later replaced the word soul. By 1890, William James defined psychology as the science of mental life. So, the focus was given on the mind itself. His aim was to an orderly and comprehensive understanding of the mental processes. What William James, somewhere in 1890s, he kind of defined psychology in terms of mental life and processes. Then the behaviorism as a school, which we will also discuss little later elaborately, when it started, it also defined the scope of psychology in a very limited sense. So, psychology then, once the behaviorism came into existence, psychology shifted focus on the science of behavior only. William James used the term mind, mental life in psychology, defining psychology, but when the behaviorism as a school of thought started, they completely removed the word mind from the psychology discipline from their perspective. They said psychology should not study mind because it cannot be observed. So, if you want to say that psychology is a scientific study, then it should not study anything that cannot be observed. That is the definition of science. So, to be true to the level of scientific study, psychology should only study behaviors. Behavior means the actions which can be observed. So, that was their whole idea, to make psychology purely scientific and only study those things which can be observed, not just what is going on in the mind which no one can see. So, the emphasis was on observable actions and measurable behavior. So, their focus was to make psychology very scientific and observable, measurable. That was their whole criteria. So, when behaviorism became very popular, even the word mind kind of got vanished from the definition of psychology. So, this is how it evolved. Initially study of soul, then it became the science of mental life, then study of behavior. If you look at the contemporary psychology, what it is there, it is very broad in scope. Okay? The meaning of psychology evolved, as we said, the different term got more emphasis with the evolution of thoughts in psychology. But if you see the today's psychology, the contemporary psychology, the scope of psychology has evolved much more beyond those limited understanding of just behavior and so on. So, contemporary psychology has a lot of other things got included in it. It ranges from behaviors of animals, behaviors of individual humans, behaviors of crowds, groups, entire cultures and so on. So, the scope has evolved into studies from individuals to the society to the cultures, groups and so on. When we talk about specifically the human psychology, it includes things about how we think, feel, do and so on, every aspects of human, every spectrums of human behavior and thought processes. So, the scope is quite broad in that sense. So, psychologists differ in what behaviors they prioritize, different psychologies based on what is their preferences. They also differ in terms of what are the things they focus on while they do research. For example, some focus only on observable and measurable behaviors, typically the behaviorist school of thought people. For example, some psychologists may only focus on behavior, like they will do research on people like a person spending hours on online. They will see how their behaviors are manifested. Let us say a researcher interested in studying online behavior, they will see what is the number of hours that person is spending on online activities and so on. So, this is a behavior that can be observed. Okay? Others may emphasize not just behavior, they may emphasize what are the internal mental processes behind it. Although the person is spending time online, let us say, but what is the reasons behind it? What are the mental factors that may lead to online behavior? So, the other psychologists may be more interested in the thoughts and feelings that is causing those behaviors. So, those are called internal processes which cannot be directly observed, but can be considered very important in terms of explaining and can be inferred from those behaviors. So, in that sense they are measurable indirectly. So, for example, if somebody may have excessive internet use as a behavior, so observable behavior, you can see the person is excessively using internet, or in the online context the behavior is very too much into the online context, for example. So, that is only observable behavior, but there can be an underlying cause behind it. Maybe the person has some kind of feelings of intimidation or feelings of nervousness, anxieties, or maybe lack of confidence, that the person is finding internet as a source to express himself or finding engagement in online context, because the person may not be comfortable in social world and so on. So, this could be one of the reasons. So, the reason could lie inside that person. So, these internal reasons are also may not be directly visible to psychologists, but are very important in understanding the causes behind the behaviors. So, that is why the understanding of psychology evolves with including diverse factors, not just observable behaviors, as behaviorist school of thought focused only on observable behavior, that may not be enough to explain human behavior. So, today psychology is both a science as well as profession. So, when we talk about psychology as a discipline, it is not just an academic discipline. We should understand a lot of the social science disciplines are typical academic disciplines, but psychology in that sense is little different. In that sense, it is a science, it is an academic discipline which studies about human behavior and mental processes, but at the same time psychology has a very strong professional part to it. So, psychology has a lot of professional involvement, professional applications in the various professions also, which we will look into it. So, as a scientist, psychologists conduct research, discovers new knowledge just like any other discipline. As a profession, psychologists apply those knowledge into various contexts of human life, like in the to help individuals, groups, organizations, as well as in any other like schools and so on. So, those understanding of psychological understanding, whatever we gathered through research, are applied in the different context of life. So, that becomes a part of profession of psychology. So, psychology has a very strong as a discipline, as an academic content, as a science. It is also a very important discipline which has very important professional side to it. So, if you look at applied psychology, so how psychology is applied in different contexts, and that becomes the foundation for professional aspect of this discipline. So, psychologists apply the principles of psychology to solve lot of real life problems. For example, the principles of psychological understanding can be applied for promoting mental health in the business context, education, sports, law, medicine, designings of machines and so on. So, this course will also focus on in a lot of these applications. We will also elaborate on this. Okay? So, these applications become foundation for the professional side of this discipline. Now, let us look into what are the goals of psychology as a discipline, what it aims to do. Obviously, we have understood that it scientifically studies what it studies behavior and mental processes. So, that is the content of the discipline, human behavior and mental processes. It includes both human as well as animal behaviors. Now, what it aims to do by studying behaviors, by studying mental processes, what are the goals of psychology, what it aims to achieve. So, there are four main goals of psychology. One is to describe behavior or mental processes, predict, explain and control behavior. So, these are the four goals of psychology. If you look at any sub-disciplines of psychology, any research in psychology, all this research will have at least one of these goals or maybe combination of these goals. So, let us see what are these goals one by one. So, the first goal of psychology is to describe behavior, describe mental processes. So, description, you see something and then describe it. So, that is the first goal. Okay? So, what is the goal? Accurately observe, record and describe behaviors and mental processes. So, you see, observe people, observe how they behave, observe what is happening in the natural behavior setting, observe it, record it without personal biases. You just have to observe how people are behaving in the natural setup or whatever the setup they are into it, and then you record it and describe it. So, that is the first goal of psychology, is to describe behavior and mental processes. For example, a researcher systematically observes children in a playground. Let us say a researcher is interested in seeing how children behave naturally in the natural setup, and they may be interested into certain types of behavior like how children engage in aggressive behavior. Okay? So, they would be more interested to see how naturally children behaves aggressively when they are put into playground with other children and so on. So, the researcher will just passively observe and see how they are behaving in a certain context. So, researcher will note how often children engaged in aggressive behavior such as hitting, shouting and so on. So, that will be the part of the data collection. The data collected provide factual account of what is happening in a particular setup. Within those setup, how children are behaving, and more specifically maybe let us say for example, the researcher is interested in finding the aggressive behavior of the children. So, the researcher will just record it and describe it as it happens in a particular setup. Generally the researcher will not be biased in terms of, obviously the one has to interpret the result, but not like you do not mix up what you see with your own ideas, then it will become biased. So, that is called the description part of one of the goal of psychology is to describe behavior. Second goal is to predict. So, these are like one after the other, how can we get engaged with the behavior in a more complex ways. Description is a very simple thing. Next goal is to predict. So, here you psychologists are not just interested into describing what is there available, they will go beyond what is present and see can we predict their future behavior by looking at what kind of things they have in the present context, can we predict it how they are likely to behave in the future. So, that is called prediction part of it. So, that lot of researchers are also interested into that part. For example, prior research shows that children who witness aggressive behaviors are more likely to behave aggressively. For example, this is a hypothesis, the children who witness or see other people behaving aggressively, or let us say children who sees lot of violent programs in the TV. So, they are exposed to aggression either in the real world or in the let us say televisions, social media, whatever it is. One can make a hypothesis that the more you see those aggressive behaviors, more that children or that child or that children is likely to behave aggressively in the future, because the person is learning by observing. So, this can be an hypothesis based on a certain theory. Okay? So, based on those patterns, psychology can predict. Obviously, he needs to collect data and see whether that prediction is correct in the future or not. You have to take multiple sets of data and so on. So, but here what researcher is interested into prediction of behavior. Let us say today a child is observing lot of these aggressive behaviors either in the real world or maybe in the televisions. What is the impact of that? Will it make that child more aggressive in the future? So, the psychologist may be interested into this prediction part of it. Okay? If someone is interested in that, that means the goal is to predict. So, this is another goal of psychologists. Lot of psychologists try to predict the future behavior based on certain present context. The third goal is to explain. Now, this is more important. You can just describe certain behavior, what is happening, then it may not be of much value. Anybody can see lot of things and then describe things, but the value of lot of understanding comes when you are able to explain what is the reason behind something. So, if you see, for example is given here, psychologists observe a correlation between violent TV viewing and aggression in children. So, children who see lot of these violent programs or games, whatever it is, they see lot of this positive correlation between those children who see lot of these aggressive programs and their aggression also probably increases, and so there is a positive correlation. The more they see, the more aggressive they also become. So, let us say this is a hypothesis. Now, the psychologist may be interested why this happens, what is the reason behind it, or if certain child show more aggression because of looking at aggressive programs in the TV, what is leading this relationship, what is the reason behind it. So, the psychologist is not just interested in predicting, he is interested also to explain why this is happening. So, they can conduct experiments to understand why this occurs. Possible explanation through experiment can be that children imitate aggressive role models because they see something and they try to imitate it, because they feel good by looking at them, their behavior. So, they will see, let me do it also. It may be also possible violent content reduces sensitivity to aggression. You simply become less sensitive and you become more aggressive, because you become less sensitive to what others are feeling simply because of looking at too much of aggression. So, you are also more likely to be more aggressive because you are less sensitive. Okay? So, they can be try to find out reasons behind why something is happening. This is much more important to understand. So, psychologists also try to explain behavior. So, the goal is to why something is happening, and the last goal is to, even if you know everything, you can describe, you can explain, but if you cannot really apply those things to make changes among people, then also it is not of much use. You can only explain lot of things, but then can we apply those understanding and make changes in people? If I find a child is becoming more aggressive by seeing those aggressive programs, can I make an intervention and change the behavior of the child? That is more important. So, psychologists also try to do lot of research in the application part of it, which is called control or change, to influence or modify behavior in a beneficial way. Can we make changes in human behavior which are not helpful and make behaviors which are helpful, more adaptive? So, that is very important. So, that is called control and change. Lot of psychologists also focus on changing people behavior in a positive way. For example, therapists use techniques such as cognitive behavior therapy to help client replace negative thoughts and behaviors into healthier ones. A lot of these therapies and things that people do research, they try to understand how can we change people's behavior, negative behavior to positive behavior, negative thoughts to positive thoughts, more healthy thoughts. How can people help people to adapt to their life situations? So, these are all control and applied part of it. Okay? Help a person overcome phobias and fears, anxieties by gradually exposing them to different controlled environments. So, these are all control and change part of it. Similarly, it can be at the organizational level, psychologists can apply lot of principles in the schools to implement change behaviors of students and so on. So, there can be different levels of applications. So, psychologists also try to control and change behaviors in a beneficial way. So, these are the 4 goals of psychology, and each goals kinds of become more and more evolved and advanced, from description to prediction to explanation to control. All these are goals of psychologists. People do research by combination of all these goals, sometimes one goal, sometimes mix of goals and so on. So, these are the important aims and goals of psychology. Now, let us very briefly go into the origin and history of psychology, some of the historical aspects of psychology as a discipline, how it evolved as a discipline. So, that is very important. Without those background, probably we will not understand why the status of psychology in the present context. To understand that, we need to understand how it evolved to this stage. So, the discipline like psychology, which focuses on human mind, thought processes, human actions, you cannot find a clear starting point, because as long as human beings became evolved enough to understand and reflect on themselves, psychology as a discipline started from there actually. So, it may not be a formal discipline, but the content started, people started understanding why somebody behaved like this. The moment we become conscious of those things, why I behave, why I feel like that. So, whenever this question arises, we are actually engaged in psychological content only. So, we cannot actually pinpoint any specific clear starting point of psychology, because it started with the evolution of human beings. When they become self-conscious, psychology started actually. So, its story likely began when early human developed capacity to reflect on human nature, and we cannot pinpoint when it started, The moment started, people started thinking about themselves and explain others' behavior, psychology actually started. The serious inquiry into psychology dates back to ancient Greece. So, if you look at ancient Greeks, particularly the Greek philosophers, lot of content, although it was in the philosophy, content was about psychology only. Lot of philosophers, so I will not like go into specific philosophers. If you read any philosophers in the Greek, ancient Greek, they were all engaged in focusing on understanding human mind, behavior and the different aspects to it. So, it became much more like rigorous in terms of understanding human mind from the ancient Greece itself. For thousands of years, psychology was not a separate discipline, but it was typically in the domain of philosophers and religion and so on. Okay? Philosophers were looking into the psychological dimension, theologians, religious content and so on, writers, literature and so on, everybody were looking into or engaging with the various aspects of human psychology. However, psychology as a separate discipline, as a scientific discipline, it did not emerge till 19th century, late 19th century it started. Before that, it was all mixed up in philosophy, religion, literature and so on. People have been engaged with the inquiry of psychological content, but it was more into philosophical abstract thinking and those things. As a scientific discipline, it started in the late 19th century. So, psychology became an experimental scientific discipline only. So, the specific person who is given credited for this is Wilhelm Wundt. He was a German scientist. In 1879, the first scientific laboratory dedicated solely to psychology was established in the Germany, place called Leipzig. So, that was the first psychological laboratory where actual scientific research started in psychology. So, that was 1879. Before that, psychology was all mixed up in philosophy and all the theology and so on. So, that was kind of, you can say, specific time period in which it became a separate discipline or scientific discipline. So, this marked the transition of psychology from philosophy to science or as a separate discipline. So, that was the period. Wilhelm Wundt, therefore, he is also called the father of psychology. People also call him father of experimental psychology, because he started the discipline as a scientific discipline. So, Wundt's laboratory established him as the first scientist of the mind, because he actually did experiments in terms of understanding human mind. So, he was not just doing philosophical debates and discussions. He was actually in the laboratory trying to understand the mind and the content of the mind and so on. So, the bridge from ancient philosophical thoughts to modern psychology is commonly traced from Wilhelm Wundt research. That was the first starting point. Then one of his disciple, Titchener, Edward Titchener, he also contributed a lot initially, and their initial research actually were associated with a school of thought called structuralism. So, that was the first school of thought in psychology. Because of Wilhelm Wundt and his disciples, they structured their research around in certain ways to understand the structure of human mind. So, initially this school of thought is called as structuralism, and this school played very significant role in shaping psychology's development in the future. So, this was the starting ground of psychology, which helped psychology to become scientific discipline, and it gave the foundation for further development of the discipline. If you look at early American psychologists, few more American psychologists also got involved with Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory. The first American to work with Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory was G. Stanley Hall. He founded the first American Psychological Association in 1892. He was the founder of American Psychological Association, which is still one of the most authoritative organization in the field of psychology. He was the founder. He served the first president of American Psychological Association. In 1883, Stanley Hall established the first psychological laboratory in the US. So, he started working with Wilhelm Wundt laboratory, and then he established psychological laboratory in the US first, in the Johns Hopkins University. Although Hall was likely the early American psychologist, he was one of the first key person in the American psychology. William James of Harvard University is generally recognized as the father of American psychology. Okay. So, these are the very important persons who contributed in the psychology in the initial year, particularly in the America, and William James, who also developed a lot of understanding and school of thought, which we will look into it, is also called as a father of American psychology. So, the structuralism was the first school of thought that started with Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory, the first school of thought around which the first scientific study of psychology actually started. So, what is the structuralism school as a school of thought? What was the idea? What Wilhelm Wundt and his disciples were trying to understand? So, let us see. So, structuralism, this is the first formal school of thought of psychology, which focused on breaking down mental processes into their basic component. So, why it is called structuralism? Because the focus was to find out the structure of human mind or consciousness. There is also the term consciousness. So, the idea is, when we talk about human mind, what are its components? So, that was the focus. What is the structure of human mind? What are the things that we can locate in mind, and say ki by combining all these component, mind becomes mind. So, that was the idea called structuralism. That is why it is called the school called structuralism, because the focus was to understand the structure of human mind. So, to discover the structure of the adult mind by analyzing sensation, feelings, images and so on, they were trying to do that. So, analogy is like this. For example, a chemistry person breaks down water into hydrogen and oxygen, structuralists tried to break down conscious experience into basic elements. They said just like natural scientists, like people who are in the chemistry, they try to break down and find out what are the components of, let us say, water into hydrogen and oxygen. Similarly, they were trying to find out, structuralists were trying to find out what are the components or structures of human mind, specific components. This school was very prominent in 1870s to 1890s. Initially, it was prominent for 1 or 2 decades. Then obviously, the other school of thought came into existence and its popularity reduced and so on. So, what was the key founder, as we said? Wilhelm Wundt and his disciples were the main persons who developed this school of thought, who, as we already discussed, Wilhelm Wundt was also called as is also called as the father of psychology. His disciple Edward B. Titchener, who started or gave the formal name of the school of thought called structuralism, and he also brought these ideas into United States. The primary method through which they were trying to understand the structure of human mind is called as introspection. So, this introspection means what? It was the process of looking inward by observing one's own psychological processes. So, basically you have to look inward and see if you are given a stimulus and see how it is being represented in the mind and find out the components. So, that was called introspection. Through this method of introspection, they were trying to find out the structure of human mind. So, procedure was very simple. Subjects were presented with an object, for example, an apple. They have to report various sensations around the apple, like its redness, crispiness, sweetness, and they have to find out when this stimulus is presented, how it is, what are the aspects of it is presented in the mind, what is the sensation of it, what is the feeling of it. So, like this. So, they were trying to understand the how when a stimulus is presented and how is this represented in the mind and what are the components to it. So, based on a lot of such introspection exercises, they found there are 3 elements to consciousness or the mind, or the 3 components. What are these components? One is called sensations. It is a basic elements of perception. It arises from stimulation of senses. So, whenever you see something, it stimulates our senses through sight, sound and smells. So, that stimulation is called sensation. Okay. So, this is the first element of mind, sensation according to this school of thought. Second is images. We also create images of those stimuli in our mind. So, these are elements of ideas, memories of thoughts or things that are not present. Now, if I have this particular thing, I can see it, but when it is not there, I can imagine it in my mind. So, that is the image part of it. When it is not present, how do you represent it in the mind? So, these are mental representation, not currently present images. Example, imagining your classroom, recalling a friend's face, these are all images. So, one component of mind is sensation, second is images according to this school of thought, and the third is called affections or feelings. The elements of emotions, like whenever you see something, what are the emotions associated with it? Love, sadness, discomfort, whatever it is. These are simple emotional qualities attached to experiences. So, structuralism found that these are the 3 basic components of mind or consciousness: sensation, images, affections. They combine to form all the mental processes and so on. Okay? So, according to this school of thought, which was the first school of thought. Obviously, this school of thought slowly declined. One of the criticism was that introspection is too subjective and everybody will give different reports for same thing. So, it is very unreliable in that sense. So, introspection was unreliable, different people reported different sensations for the same stimulus. So, the reliability was questioned. So, the popularity of structuralism slowly decreased, and thus because it cannot be used to study children, animals and those with mental disorders. So, the scope of such studies are very limited. You cannot ask a children to do introspection or an animal to do introspection and so on. So, the scope is very limited. And then the main criticism was the whole versus the parts, which led to the development of another school of thought called Gestalt psychology. The critics argued that the mind cannot be understood by looking only in the isolated part. You cannot understand mind based on what are the component of mind. Mind does not function like that. Mind works as a holistic way, and that led to another school of thought which is called Gestalt psychology, which we will talk about. And their focus is that mind should be studied as a functions as a holistic way how it functions. Not, you cannot break mind into components. So, that was another idea that led to the decline of structuralism and so on, which we will look little bit more elaborately later. So, this was the first school of thought. Similarly, at that time also a little later, William James he developed his own school of thought called functionalism, and structuralists focused on what is what of the mind, what are the components of mind. Functionalism, which was developed by William James, asked question why and how, what is the function of mind. It is not important to know what is the component of mind, it is more important what is the function of mind, what mind can do, how it does it. Why question was more important in the functionalism. So, they are more interested in to understand the functions of mind rather than the structure of mind. So, this school of psychology focused on how mental and behavioral processes function, how they enable the organism adapt, survive and flourish, why people survive, how they use mind, what is the functions of mind, how mind help them to survive and function. So, the focus was typically influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection. Mind has evolved, so there has to be some function to it, that is why it has evolved. So, evolutionary it should make sense, you know. So, the core idea in the functionalism school of thought was asking what is not what is consciousness, but what is consciousness for, what is the purpose of it, what is the function of it. So, that was the difference between functionalism and structuralism. This school was more prominent during 1980s and till 1910s and so on. So, the focus was more on understanding the functions. So, William James established these schools and he is generally considered as father of American psychology, and he wrote a very popular book called Principles of Psychology. It is a landmark textbook that took him 12 years to write, and that defined the field, and that book is still available, and it is one of the landmark book in the field of psychology. He used the term called stream of consciousness. He said he rejected the idea of breaking mind into small component, rather than says mind is like a stream of consciousness. So, he said he disagreed with the structuralist idea that the mind could be broken into bits and elements. He argued that consciousness is a continuous flowing process, just like a river. You cannot look at a single molecule of water to understand the flow of river. Similarly, you cannot freeze a moment of thought to understand the mind. So, there is a stream of consciousness that is moving and functioning. We have to look at it in that perspective, not at components to it. So, he was a kind of critic of structuralist school of thought. So, adaptation was very important. The function of mind is to adapt to the different environmental circumstances. So, mental processes evolve because they are useful in survival. So, that is a very evolutionary explanation. James believed that repetitive behavior became automatic habits to free up the conscious mind for more complex tasks. So, that means what? A lot of behaviors become automatic and repetitive in human mind simply because these are helpful. So, we create certain habits which are automatic, and like you do not have to pay much attention because it becomes automated. For example, when you start learning bicycle, initially it is very effortful, then it becomes automatic, you do not even pay attention, you can just ride it. So, that is repetitive and automatic behaviors of human mind are also functional, because then you do not have to give too much of attention and energy to it, you can focus on other things. Focusing more on functions over form, thinking, feeling and remembering exist because they helped our ancestors navigate their environment. So, focus, if you see again and again, the focus was given on the functions of mind rather than the content of mind and so on. Then emerged one of the most prominent school of thought, which is still we can see in the contemporary area also, still there are people, this school of thought is still existing, that is the behaviorist school of thought. John Watson was the person who developed, or who is the father of behaviorism. Behaviorist thoughts were very different, as I already said, that they are focusing only on scientific inquiry, and they said human mind word should not be used because it is not necessary, because you cannot see mind, but focus on behavior. So, therefore, the idea of behaviorism as a school of thought emerged. So, the core idea is what? Behaviorists argued that because we cannot see a thought or a feeling, they are not fit for scientific study. So, that was their argument. Okay. Psychology should be an objective science that studies behavior without reference to mental processes. They said we should study behaviors only without focusing and explaining things related to mental processes. So, they said this is like a black box, the mind is a black box, we cannot see what goes, we can only see what goes in, that is the stimulus, and what comes out and there is a response. We can only see what is the stimulus and then out of the how person respond to that stimulus as a response. In between what is there in the mind is a black box. We cannot really see what is going on there, but we do not need to know what happens inside. According to them, we do not need to know. We can explain based on stimulus and response. So, that was their idea of behavior school. So, the emergence of behavior has actually emerged in early 1900s and remained dominant till 1950s. Today also this school of thought is there, but obviously not very dominant. It became a major force in psychology, focused on observable behaviors, rejected study of mental processes as we discussed. It emerged as a reaction against structuralism, introspection. They said these are not required. They are strongly influenced by experimental method, animal research and so on. These people did lot of animal research to understand this stimulus response behavior and so on. So, John Watson was the main founder of behaviorism. He was an American psychologist and who focused on observable behavior. Later on few more behaviorists also contributed. So, they rejected mental concept as we discussed. They rejected all the ideas related to mind, consciousness, thinking, feeling and so on. Their focus was on environmental shapes behavior. They focused on that human behavior is shaped by entirely environment. They did not explain anything from genetics and other things, mental factors. They said the way whatever environment you are put into, accordingly your behavior will be shaped. In fact, there is a famous claim he made that you given control over healthy infants, he could train them to become any specialist. You give me any child, healthy child, and by changing their environment, I can shape them to become any way I want. So, that was his extreme claim he made. So, he said environment is the main factors in terms of shaping human behavior. Obviously, there are a lot of limitations later found, but this was his kind of claim that environment is the main factor in terms which shapes human behavior. Obviously, modern psychology sees human development is not so easy that you can just shape them the way you want. It is much more complex than that, but that was his idea in that time. Another important scientist who contributed a lot in behavioral school of thought is B.F. Skinner. He was a Harvard psychologist and expanded behaviorism and studied how human behaviors are shaped by consequences of their behavior. Reinforcement. When you behave, what is the result of that behavior? Are you rewarded by it or are you punished because of that? So, what is the consequence of behavior that shapes behavior? So, he focused a lot on the concept called reinforcement. Yes, all these things we will discuss in the later modules in detail. So, reinforcement is main important concepts in the learning according to Skinner. Behavior is influenced by rewards, punishments, these are called reinforcers. Learning occurs through environmental consequences. So, Skinner focused on the consequences of the behavior in shaping human behavior. So, that was he kind of added new perspective in the behavioral school of thought. Another school of thought that evolved similarly at that time was Max Wertheimer Gestalt psychology. So, Wertheimer's Gestalt psychology is what actually evolved as a criticism to structuralist school of thought. So, Gestalt is a German word which means form, shape and configuration. The philosophy was we do not perceive the world in isolated bits like pixels. Our brains automatically organize sensory information into meaningful patterns. So, according to Gestalt psychology, our brain automatically looks at things in the larger perspective. They do not look at small components, they see what is overall coming out as a pattern. So, perception is more of a holistic way than you look at small things. So, it rejected the idea of Wundt's structuralist concept and it argued that essence of experience is in the holistic patterns, not in the components of it. So, Wertheimer is a German psychologist. He founded the school of thought and he emphasized on higher level mental processing and so on. So, he observed an illusion while traveling by train. He found that stationary objects like poles and houses appear to move when you are in a moving object like train. Things which were stationary, it seems they are also moving. And he said this is not a sensory error, it is an illusion created by the brain to look at a holistic perspective. So, this reflected brain based construction of movement. So, this is not an error that brain does, but brain constructs this movement. So, Gestalt research team collaborated with other people like Kohler, Kafka and so on. They together conducted experiment on perceptions, and their principles of perceptions became very popular, which we will discuss in the modules of perceptions in detail. So, their idea was very simple, that brain organizes sensory input and create meaningful representation, which is more holistic than just based on parts and bits and pieces. They emphasized on organization, patterns and overall structures. Their main idea was whole is greater than sum of the parts. So, when you see any situation or any stimulus, it is not just about small component that makes up it. You see things in a large much more broader ways. The whole is greater than sum of its parts. So, experience should not be understood based on components of what components of it, because experience is larger than just component of it. Organization gives a newer meaning, a newer perspective to it. All these things we will discuss more in the perception chapter. So, they have basically focused on active perception, pattern based perceptions and whole over parts and so on. Now, Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis was another dominant school of thought which shaped clinical psychology a lot and focused on understanding unconscious mind. This was another school of thought that emerged, and their idea was very radically different from other school of thought that we discussed. They represented a very distinct model of human mind, and they focused opposite to behaviorists who said only behavior should be studied, and these people or psychoanalysis focused only on factors which even people are even not even conscious. So, this was the very radically different concept than behaviorist school of thought. They are studying mind, not only just mind, but the part of mind which was unconscious, even people who themselves have, they are not aware of that part of the mind. So, that is called unconscious part of the mind. So, it probably one of the most popular theory in psychology. People outside psychology know about this theory more, almost every other discipline knows about it. So, it became very popular and it influenced literature, a lot of these explanations and stories and so on, movies and so on. So, it is a quite very popular and lot of influence, it is a very influential complex theory. Obviously, there are a lot of criticism around it also. So, Sigmund Freud developed this psychoanalysis. He was an Austrian physician. He developed the theory around unconscious mind, which strongly shaped clinical psychology as a branch, and it developed its own therapies and so on. So, unconscious mind basically is the part of mind which we are not even conscious of. We do not know that what is there in that, but it is continuously influencing us. It contains things like primitive sexual drives, aggressive impulses, unfulfilled wishes which we see in dreams and so on. All these are part of unconscious mind according to Sigmund Freud, and they all influence us all the time without our conscious knowledge about them. And Freud said unconscious motives and behaviors, people may act many times without knowing the reasons behind their actions. Sometimes people act very irrationally. So, that may be because of unconscious mind and so on. Every behavior may have many hidden motives which could be unconscious and so on. So, his focus was very much on the unconscious aspect of human mind and so on, and he tried to explain it in so many ways which we may look into when we look at personality theories and so on. He also focused on childhood experiences plays very important role in shaping adult personality and so on. Early life experiences according to Freud is very important, which shapes your personality in the adult. He explained abnormal behavior or problematic psychological behaviors are typically, he said, the causes lies in the unconscious mind rooted in the childhood behaviors and so on. So, a lot of such explanations are there. So, this is a very radically different theory, that is why also it became very popular, and it has its lot of controversial and debatable criticism part of it also. So, Freud basically focused on how to overcome psychological problems, disorders, focus on treatment, not just laboratory experiments. He was not interested in laboratory experiments. He developed psychoanalysis more as a therapeutic school and method. Now, these are some of the earlier school of thought. Okay? Now, what is the contemporary perspective? If you look at today's world, what are the perspectives of psychology? So, in today's psychology, if you look at it, psychology is more dynamic and evolving discipline. So, all these school of thought evolved. Some school actually became or declined simply because they could not have the necessary evidence in the newer research perspective. So, built upon contributions of early founders, psychology evolved, continuously adapted to newer research findings, social changes, technological advancement, content and the thoughts also evolved. If you see a lot of this early school of thought that we discussed, structuralism, gestalt psychology, psychoanalysis, behaviorism and so on that we discussed, some early schools like structuralism have largely faded. We do not see anyone talking about this school of thought in today's perspective. Others continue with smaller groups and followers, like behaviorism and so on. There obviously behaviorism still has a lot of application in the therapies and so on, but the influence has really shrink. Foundational school have evolved, merged into broader perspective. Lot of schools actually merged and became newer perspectives, newer thoughts kind of get merged with them and so on. So, major foundational schools that we discussed are like functionalism, behaviorism, gestalt psychoanalysis. This school shaped modern psychological thinking, and a lot of this school actually evolved and some faded and so on. Modern psychology, if you see in today's psychology, broadly 6 major perspectives are still very prominent. Behavioral focus, which came from behavioral school of thought that we discussed, still we can find lot of behavioral application in today's psychology also. Psychodynamic, basically it came from psychoanalysis, it became psychodynamic because many newer thoughts also kind of merged with it and become school of thought called psychodynamic school of thought, but still it focuses on unconscious aspect of processes, but lot of things changed. Humanistic school of thought focuses on free will, personal growth, self actualization and so on. This is still prominent in today's perspective. Physiological psychology focus on biological processes to behavior, genetics contribution and so on. Cognitive psychology, which is very dominant in today's world, today's psychology focuses on mental processes such as thinking, memory, perception and so on. Socio-cultural perspective recognizes importance of socio-cultural context on behavior. So, human behavior is not just universal, and every aspect of behavior is not universal. Our behavior is also shaped by society and cultures that we are into it. So, socio-cultural perspectives, cultural psychology, these all focuses on context of influence of context on human behavior, how culture shapes behavior, how society shapes human behavior. So, these are the like all these perspective are dominant part of contemporary psychology if you look at it. Some of it came from the earlier school of thought, some of these schools actually evolved from the earlier schools, some of the earlier school of thought actually faded and so on. So, if you see the various fields of psychology in today's scenario, there are some theoretical fields, there are some applied fields, some of these things we have already discussed. Theoretical fields include general psychology, abnormal psychology, developmental psychology, comparative psychology, experimental psychology, physiological psychology, social psychology, even things like parapsychology and so on, which are not like part of core psychology and so on. Applied psychology may include things like clinical psychology, educational psychology, organizational psychology, counseling psychology, consumer psychology, psychology applied in law, crime and so on. So, it has both theoretical fields and as well as applied fields. Now, psychology also I said is a profession, like it has a professional component to it because of this application part of it. So, psychology addresses human issues in personal context, social setting, educational institution, organization and workplace, health and legal systems. Basically, in all these contexts, psychology principles are applied in all these contexts. So, it becomes part of profession. So, key areas of professional practice, if you see in today's world how psychologists are, what are the areas in which professional psychologists work in. It may include things like clinical psychology, this is a professional area where people work in diagnosis, treatment of psychological disorder, counseling psychology, educational psychology, industrial, organizational psychology, forensic psychology, health psychology, sports psychology and so on. So, these are the areas where professional practice, psychologists work as a professional practice, they become a professional person who give expertise in all these areas. Just to give brief 1 or 2 examples, like clinical psychologists, what they do? They assess, diagnose and treatment of mental health disorders, emotional and behavioral problems, this is what they do. So, a lot of clinical psychologists you will find in the hospitals, in educational institutions and so on, their idea is to, their work is to do mental health disorders treatment, diagnosis and so on. They use a talk therapy, psychological testing to find out and then treat. They include in various work settings such as hospitals, private clinics, schools, community centers and so on. You will find clinical psychologists in all the settings. Counseling psychologist, for example, is very related to clinical psychology, but little different. It helps individuals cope with stress, grief, relationship issues, career decisions. So, counseling psychologists do not really go too much into this disorders part, that is done by clinical psychologists. They mostly help in general issues like coping with the problems of stress, relationship issues, career decisions. They focus on adjustment and life transitions. They will give less emphasis on severe mental disorders, which are typically dealt by psychiatrists and clinical psychologists. Industrial organization psychologists, what they do? They apply psychology to workplaces. Focus area includes employee selection and training, motivation and productivity, how to train leaders, how to motivate employees, and those things based on psychological principles. Leadership, organizational development, works in corporate and organizational settings. So, these are the settings in which they work, and so these are some of the examples of how psychologists work as a professional and in how they work in the professional setup. So, this is some of the broad areas in which broad like some brief story around psychology, how psychology is defined, what are the historical aspects of psychology, how psychology evolved and how it reached in the today's stage in which it is, and what are the theoretical and applied aspects to it. So, this is just a brief introduction to psychology, and we will elaborate on some of these concepts more and more as we progress in the course. With this, I stop here. Thank you.